The front door wasn't forced, the lights were still on, and yet Emily Carter had vanished as if the house itself had swallowed her. It was a warm weekday evening in a quiet American suburb where people recognized each other's cars and waved without thinking. Emily, 26, a young mother with tired eyes and a patient smile, had spent the day moving through familiar routines, wiping counters, folding tiny shirts, answering her children's questions with the same calm voice she used when she was running low on sleep. Her husband, Ryan Carter, worked late that day. Before leaving, he kissed Emily on the cheek and promised he'd be home in time to help with bedtime. Emily teased him about the promise, gentle, automatic, the kind of joke married couples recycle when life gets busy. Then she watched him drive away and went back inside, where the air smelled faintly of dish soap and warm laundry. But that afternoon, someone else was moving through the neighborhood with a different kind of routine. His name was Daniel Frost, and he didn't belong there, not really. He cruised slowly past trimmed hedges and basketball hoops, past sprinklers ticking like quiet metronomes. He looked ordinary in the way dangerous people often try to look ordinary: clean shirt, neutral expression, hands steady on the wheel. He wasn't visiting anyone. He wasn't lost. He was hunting for a moment when no one was watching closely enough. Emily noticed nothing at first. A car passing was just a car passing. A shadow shifting on the porch was just the evening changing. Her kids were near her, their voices bouncing off the walls, and that made the world feel safe, until it didn't. At some point, something pulled her attention toward the front of the house. Maybe it was a sound. Maybe it was instinct. The kind that lifts the hair on your arms before your brain can explain why. She moved toward the entryway, fingertips brushing the edge of the doorframe, and paused. Outside, the neighborhood was still. Too still. And then, suddenly, the stillness broke: quick footsteps, a quick breath, a shape too close to the doorway. Emily tried to react, but life doesn't always give a warning you can use. In a blink, a hand clamped, a voice hissed, and the gap between normal evening and nightmare vanished. The children cried out. A chair scraped. The sound of a struggle was brief, sharp, panicked, muffled by walls that had never needed to protect anyone before. Minutes later, the house returned to silence. When Ryan came home, the sky had deepened into dusk. He parked in the driveway, already loosening his tie, already thinking about bedtime stories and leftover pasta. He called out, expecting Emily's voice from the kitchen. No answer. Inside, everything looked untouched, her purse still where she usually kept it, keys not gone, shoes still lying near the mat. The dinner dishes sat half-finished, like time had stopped mid-breath. And in the living room, their children were alone, wide-eyed, trembling, and far too quiet. Ryan's heart thudded as the truth began to form. Not a misunderstanding. Not a quick errand. Something had taken Emily from her own home. And somewhere nearby, more than one phone was already dialing for help, while Emily, fighting for control of her own voice, made a call that should have changed everything. Emily's breath came in short, uneven pulls as the car sped away from her home. The interior smelled of fuel and stale fabric, the windows darkened just enough to blur the world rushing past. Her wrists were pinned, her movements restricted, and every turn of the road drove home one terrifying truth: she was no longer in control of where she was going. She fought anyway. Her phone was still in her hand, somehow. Fingers shaking, she pressed the screen with desperate precision, forcing herself to stay quiet while her heart pounded hard enough to hurt. When the line connected, her voice cracked, not with screaming, but with urgency. "My name is Emily Carter," she whispered. "I've been taken. Please. I'm in a car. He's driving." The operator tried to ask questions, but the connection faltered. The car accelerated, wind noise swallowing parts of her words. Emily tried to describe what she could: the color of the seats, the way the road curved, the sound of tires on uneven pavement. Then the call dropped. Minutes later, another call came in. A neighbor. Then another, from a woman driving through the area who had seen something that didn't sit right. A dark-colored sedan. A woman in the passenger seat. Her movements frantic, her head turning sharply toward the windows. At one intersection, the woman pressed her hands against the glass, mouth open as if she were screaming. "I think she needs help," the caller told dispatch. "Something's wrong." But the information didn't flow the way it should have. Calls were logged separately. Details weren't stitched together. Different agencies received fragments of the same story without realizing they were holding pieces of the same emergency. Time passed in small, deadly increments. Back at the Carter home, police arrived to flashing lights and panicked children. Ryan stood on the front lawn, hands shaking, repeating the same sentence again and again. She wouldn't leave without her phone. Or her purse. She wouldn't leave them. Officers began canvassing the area, knocking on doors, asking neighbors if they'd seen anything unusual. One man mentioned a car driving slowly earlier that afternoon. Another recalled a vehicle idling longer than necessary near the corner. But without a clear direction, the search spread thin. Meanwhile, Daniel Frost kept driving. At one point, Emily managed to unlock the door with her foot, pushing it outward just inches. Cold air rushed in, carrying the sound of passing traffic. She kicked again, harder this time, and the door swung wider. Daniel swerved, shouting, yanking her back inside. The car fishtailed before straightening, tires screaming against the asphalt. Emily's chance vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Later that evening, Daniel pulled into a familiar driveway, his own relative's house. He acted calm, casual, asking for a shovel, a flashlight, and some fuel, as if preparing for nothing more than an inconvenient chore. Inside the car, Emily listened, hope flickering as footsteps moved away. She tried again, pushing, kicking, twisting, her movements wild now, fueled by raw fear. A neighbor noticed the struggle. Another call came in. But once again, the information lagged behind reality. By the time officers began narrowing in on the suspicious vehicle, hours had already slipped through their fingers. And somewhere beyond the reach of sirens and radios, Emily was still fighting, against a man who had already decided how the night would end. By the time the night deepened, the search for Emily Carter had become a race against invisible clocks. Radio chatter filled patrol cars as officers crisscrossed the area, headlights cutting across lawns and empty streets. Dispatchers relayed updates, but the information arrived fragmented, sightings without timelines, calls without connections. No single person could see the full picture, and without that clarity, decisions slowed. Inside the dark sedan, Daniel Frost grew increasingly tense. His earlier calm had cracked, replaced by sharp glances at mirrors and sudden turns onto unfamiliar roads. Emily sat rigid beside him, her body aching, her thoughts racing faster than the car itself. She memorized everything she could, the hum of the engine, the way the car pulled slightly to the right, the faint clicking sound when the brakes engaged. She searched for another chance. At a red light, traffic boxed them in. Emily lunged again, shoving the door outward, screaming this time, raw, unmistakable fear ripping from her chest. A driver in the next lane stared, eyes wide, horn blaring as Daniel slammed the door shut and sped through the intersection just as the light turned green. That driver called it in immediately. Moments later, another witness did too. A description finally began to solidify: dark sedan, erratic driving, distressed woman inside. But the calls were routed to different channels, each treated as a separate incident. By the time someone realized they were all describing the same vehicle, it was already miles away. Near midnight, an officer parked along a quiet stretch of road noticed a car pass too quickly, swerving slightly. He pulled out, lights flashing, heart steady with routine. The sedan slowed. Then stopped. Daniel stepped out, forcing a polite smile, hands raised just enough to look cooperative. He answered questions with clipped confidence, explaining his late-night drive, his reasons rehearsed and thin. The officer shined a light into the car. What he saw made his stomach tighten. Scratches along the interior. A phone wedged under the seat. Items that didn't belong. The signs were subtle, but together they formed something deeply wrong. Daniel was detained. But Emily was not there. As the officer radioed for backup, the reality hit: whatever had happened, it hadn't ended with this traffic stop. The clock hadn't stopped ticking. It had only grown louder. Detectives were notified. Search teams mobilized. The radius widened, stretching into wooded areas and back roads where headlights disappeared into blackness. Ryan waited at home, gripping his phone, each second dragging heavier than the last. Then, hours later, a call came through. A shallow patch of disturbed ground. Too fresh. Too deliberate. Under the first scrape of dirt, hope vanished. Emily Carter was found where she should never have been, far from her children, far from the life she had been living just hours earlier. The confirmation rippled through the investigation with brutal clarity. This was no longer a rescue. It was a reckoning. And Daniel Frost, sitting alone under fluorescent lights, had no idea just how much evidence was already closing in around him. The investigation shifted overnight from urgency to precision. By morning, the area where Emily Carter had been found was sealed off, marked by quiet movements and lowered voices. Detectives worked methodically, documenting every detail, every footprint, every disturbance in the earth. Nothing was rushed now. Nothing could be missed. Back at the station, Daniel Frost sat across from investigators, his posture stiff, his answers carefully measured. He denied involvement at first, offering explanations that unraveled almost as soon as they were spoken. Each timeline conflicted with the last. Each answer created new questions. Meanwhile, evidence began to speak more clearly than Daniel ever could. Emily's phone, recovered from the vehicle, placed her exactly where witnesses had said she was. Surveillance cameras from traffic intersections captured the sedan moving across the city in a jagged path, stopping where it shouldn't have, turning where no one else did. A license plate reader confirmed the route. Forensic specialists examined the car in detail. Fibers. Marks. Items that linked the interior of the vehicle directly to Emily and to the struggle multiple witnesses had described. Nothing stood alone. Everything connected. As news spread, the community reeled. Candlelight vigils appeared on the same street where children once rode bikes and neighbors once waved without worry. Emily's name was spoken softly, often followed by long silences. Ryan stood among friends and strangers alike, holding his children close, trying to answer questions no parent should ever have to face. Then came the recordings. Emergency calls, played back, time-stamped, dissected, revealed the cracks that had cost precious time. Emily's voice. Frightened but clear. Witnesses describing the same car, the same woman, the same danger. All of it had been there. But it hadn't come together when it mattered most. Internal reviews began almost immediately. Agencies retraced decisions, handoffs, miscommunications. The realization settled heavily: the system had not failed to receive the warning, it had failed to act on it fast enough. When charges were formally filed against Daniel Frost, the list was extensive and unmistakable. Investigators laid out the timeline piece by piece, showing how intent had formed long before Emily was taken, how opportunity had been sought, not stumbled upon. In the courtroom, Daniel finally stopped pretending. The weight of the evidence was too heavy. Witnesses were lined up. Experts were ready. The story of that night, every wrong turn, every missed connection, every final moment, was prepared to be told in full. For Ryan, the days blurred together, marked only by court dates and quiet evenings that felt impossibly loud. He didn't seek revenge. He sought truth. Accountability. Something solid to stand on after everything else had been taken away. And as the trial approached, one thing became clear to everyone watching. This case was no longer just about one man's actions. It was about everything that allowed him to get as far as he did. The trial began under a weight that could be felt before a single word was spoken. The courtroom was filled each morning, family members seated stiffly, reporters lining the back wall, strangers drawn by the gravity of what had happened. Daniel Frost entered in silence, his expression blank, avoiding every face except his own reflection in the polished table before him. Prosecutors started with the timeline. They walked the jury through Emily Carter's final day, hour by hour, call by call. They played recordings of emergency calls, not to shock, but to show clarity. Emily's voice filled the room, steady despite fear, asking for help that never arrived in time. Several jurors wiped their eyes. One stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, refusing to look away. Witnesses followed. Drivers who had seen the car. Neighbors who had noticed the struggle. The relative who had lent Daniel the shovel, the fuel, the flashlight, still haunted by the casual way the request had been made. Each testimony added another layer, another confirmation that this was not chance, not confusion, not an accident. Experts took the stand next. They explained how evidence from the vehicle aligned with witness accounts, how movement patterns matched surveillance footage, how every deviation Daniel described collapsed under scrutiny. The defense attempted to cast doubt, suggesting misinterpretation, coincidence, bad luck, but nothing held. The facts were too tightly woven. When Ryan Carter testified, the room fell into a heavy stillness. He spoke about Emily not as a headline, but as a person. Her patience. Her laugh. The way she sang softly to the kids at night. He described coming home to a house that looked normal but felt wrong in every possible way. His voice didn't break often, but when it did, no one moved. The defense declined to put Daniel on the stand. By closing arguments, the outcome felt inevitable. The prosecution didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. They reminded the jury that Emily had done everything right. She noticed danger, she asked for help, she fought for her life. And still, she was failed by both one man's actions and a system that moved too slowly. Deliberations were brief. When the jury returned, the foreperson stood, hands trembling slightly, and delivered the verdict, guilty on all charges. Daniel Frost showed no visible reaction. No apology. No denial. Just a hollow stillness. As he was led away, the room exhaled. Justice, in its legal form, had been served. But justice could not give Ryan his wife back. It could not erase the recordings. It could not undo the silence that followed unanswered calls. That reckoning would come next. In the months that followed the trial, the silence left behind by Emily Carter's absence settled into every corner of the neighborhood. The Carter house remained standing, unchanged from the outside, but inside it carried a different weight. Toys still lined the floor. Family photos still hung on the walls. Life continued, but it did so with a visible ache. Ryan focused on his children. Mornings became about routine and stability, breakfast, school, small reassurances whispered into worried ears. At night, after the house finally grew quiet, he allowed himself to grieve fully, away from curious eyes and well-meaning words that never quite fit. The case, however, refused to fade quietly. Public scrutiny turned toward the emergency response system that night. Independent reviews confirmed what the recordings had already revealed. Critical information had been divided instead of unified, passed along without urgency, and handled without the coordination the situation demanded. No single mistake stood alone, but together, they formed a devastating delay. Out of that failure came change. Dispatch protocols were rewritten. Training programs were expanded to emphasize pattern recognition across multiple calls. Agencies that once operated in parallel were forced to learn how to move as one. Emily's name appeared in internal reports, not as a statistic, but as a reminder of what happens when warnings are missed. Daniel Frost was transferred to a long-term correctional facility, where his days blended into one another under strict routine. No interviews. No statements. His story was finished, reduced to case numbers and court records. The attention he once commanded evaporated, leaving only consequence. For the community, healing came slowly. Annual walks were organized in Emily's memory. Parents became more watchful,